What happens when a starving widow is marched into a Colorado snowstorm by the very people she kept alive? They told themselves the mountain would finish the job. Instead, the mountain kept her breathing long enough to learn why her husband really died. By the spring thaw of 1932, the people of Mercy Gap would speak her name the way other places spoke of avalanches or wildfire. Not as gossip, as warning. In November of 1931, Mercy Gap clung to a high shoulder of the San Juan Mountains like something nailed there by stubbornness and prayer. It was a Depression settlement, half relief colony, half private kingdom, built by men and women who had lost farms, wages and luck. Then followed a silver-tongued organizer named Elias Fane into the timber with promises of shared labor, shared hunger, and shared redemption. Mercy Gap had rules for everything. Rules for woodcutting quotas. Rules for ration books. Rules for who could draw flour from the common store and who could borrow mules, tools, kerosene, or seed. Elias said rules were the only fence between order and starvation. Most people believed him because believing him was easier than admitting they had dragged their families onto a mountain and handed their futures to one man. Mara Quinn had believed him too, once. She and her husband Rowan had arrived 6 years earlier with blistered hands, a wagon full of cracked tools, and the kind of tired hope that looked almost like faith. Rowan could read contour lines and ore maps better than most men could read a newspaper. Mara could set a broken wrist, birth a breech baby, and split beetle-kill pine until her palms bled. Together they built Cabin 11 at the north edge of the settlement, chinked every seam, laid a stone hearth, planted turnips and onion sets in a strip of rocky ground, and made a life sturdy enough to survive bad seasons. Then, 3 weeks before the first big snow, Rowan died. That was the story Mercy Gap accepted. A tragic accident at the old stamp mill above the ridge. An unstable platform. A fall. A broken neck. Elias Fane said the mountain took men without warning. Silas Creel, Elias's broad-shouldered enforcer, swore he had found the body himself. Mara had stood over Rowan's pine box and known, in the private animal part of herself, that something about it was wrong. Not because his neck was broken. Men broke on mountains all the time. It was the bruise high on his cheekbone. The split skin across 2 knuckles, as if he had swung at someone before he died. The way Elias never met her eyes during the burial. The way Silas watched the crowd instead of the grave. Still, grief was heavy enough to crush suspicion flat. For 19 days Mara chopped wood, boiled beans, and moved through the cabin like a woman underwater. On the 20th morning, the frost was white on the inside of the window glass when she heard boots on her porch. Not 1 pair. 4. Elias Fane standing there in his black wool coat, had brims silvered with rime. He was 58, narrow-faced, meat-bearded, with a bookkeeper's fingers and a preacher's eyes. Beside him stood Silas Creel, big as an ox, wearing a buffalo hide coat and the lazy expression of a man who preferred force because it demanded less imagination. Behind them waited 2 councilmen with rifles resting easy in their arms. They were not there with food. They were not there with condolences. Elias removed 1 glove finger by finger. Mara, he said, as if they were about to discuss fence posts. By vote of the council, Cabin 11 and its stores are being returned to the cooperative. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him. Returned. Rowan died carrying community debt. Elias's voice stayed calm, almost tender. 2 mule teams borrowed in August. Shared seed allotment in the spring. Medical supplies taken during the influenza wave. Under the charter, a surviving household member must still meet winter labor quota. A lone widow cannot. Mara stared at him. That cabin was built with our own hands. It stands on cooperative ground. The food in that cellar is ours. The seed was extended through the store. Silas stepped forward and shoved a folded sheet against her chest. You have 45 minutes, he said. Pack what you can carry. The page was real enough. Elias's signature, 3 council marks. A charter clause Mara had never imagined would be used as a rope around her own throat. The yard had filled while they spoke. Mercy Gap gathered quickly for spectacle. Men who had borrowed Rowan's tools. Women who had sat at Mara's table. Children she had stitched up after hatchet slips and dog bites. Nora Bell stood near the gate with her shawl pulled tight, the same Nora whose first child Mara had delivered in a whiteout after the doctor from Silverton failed to come. Nora did not look at her. Neither did anyone else. That was the part Mara remembered longest. Not the words. The silence. It was one thing to be robbed. Another thing entirely to be abandoned by witnesses. Under Silas's watch, Mara packed 2 dresses, 1 blanket, a flint striker, a hunting knife, a small sack of jerked venison and hard biscuits. When she reached for Rowan's Winchester over the hearth, Silas put a hand on it first. Cooperative asset. My husband bought that rifle in Durango. With cooperative labor hauling ore from the North Cut. It was a lie so casual it almost stunned her. She reached for her shearling winter coat. Elias stopped her with a glance. Issued last January from common stores, he said. That stays. So you mean to turn me out in November without a coat? I mean to preserve what belongs to everyone. Mara almost laughed then, because nothing exposed greed faster than the language greedy men use to perfume it. 45 minutes ended. Silas and the 2 council men marched her north along the wagon track, past the smokehouse, past the mule barn, past the last split rail fence. Snow had begun to drift down in soft, testing flakes. By the time they reached the boundary marker, a rusted chain strung between cedar posts, the light was already thinning. Beyond that line there was no cabin, no stocked cellar, no common store, no doctor, no neighbor. Only dark timber, broken rock, and the long descent into winter. Silas cut the chain with a hook and jerked his chin toward the forest. Keep going. Mara turned and looked back at Mercy Gap. Chimney smoke lifted blue from her roof. Her wood stacked under her eaves. Her garden plot hard with frost. Every board of that cabin still held Rowan's hands in it, and Elias meant to sleep under those boards before the week was over. If I come back? She asked. Silas rested a hand on the revolver at his hip. Then you'll be treated as a thief or trespasser. Mountain law after dark. Elias did not threaten her. That made it worse. He only nodded once, like a man closing a ledger. May God put peace in you, Mara. They turned away. No one watched to see whether she cried. The wind came harder after sundown, slipping through her sleeves, needling her throat, stealing heat by the second. Panic arrived clean and cold. The nearest true town was days away through country already sharpening itself for snow. Without shelter she would not live to see another sunrise. That was not melodrama. It was arithmetic. She stood there perhaps 5 seconds, maybe 10, long enough to understand that Elias had not expelled her because she was useless. He had expelled her because he wanted Rowan's cabin, Rowan's land strip, Rowan's silence, and her death would make the accounting easier. Something changed in her then. Grief did not leave. It hardened. She turned her back on Mercy Gap and headed uphill instead of down. 3 summers earlier, Rowan had taken her deep into the north timber after a mule deer he had winged near dusk. They had climbed above the game trails, above the old cuts, into a basin of broken shale and wind-bent spruce where the mountains looked stripped to the bone. Near midnight he had laughed, vanished through a spill of juniper and talus, then called softly for her to follow. Behind the rocks, hidden from any line of sight below, was the black mouth of an abandoned prospect drift. A short tunnel driven into the mountain decades earlier, then forgotten when the vein pinched out. Rowan had called it Lantern Drift. Good place to outlast weather, he had said. Good place to hide from men too. At the time she had thought he was being charming. Men in the hills liked naming holes in the ground as if they were staking friendship with the earth. Now it was the only thing standing between her and the cold. The climb took what little remained of daylight and much of the night. The trail vanished. More than once Mara slipped knee-deep into drifts between buried stones. Her fingers went numb inside wet wool. Her lungs burned with each breath. Coyotes called from somewhere lower in the dark, and every sound beyond the reach of her sight threatened teeth. She moved by memory, slope angle, and spite. Up through jack pine. Across a dry wash. Around a scar of red rock Rowan had once called iron bloom, past a lightning-struck spruce split from crown to trunk. She found the ridge of shattered shale by moonlight and crawled the rest of the way on hands and knees, dragging the rucksack behind her. When she finally saw the tangle of juniper at the base of the outcrop, she almost missed it. The drift mouth was narrower than she remembered, half hidden by fallen stone and dead needles. She shoved through, smashed her shoulder on the rock lip, stumbled into darkness, and collapsed face first on the dry earth inside. The wind was gone. That alone felt like resurrection, but as feeling returned to her hands in jagged needles of pain, Mara understood a harder truth. Shelter was not safety. Lantern. Drift kept out the sky, yes. It did nothing yet to keep out cold, hunger, or time. The mountain had not spared her, it had only given her a place to argue with death. Morning proved how thin that mercy was. Mara woke with her teeth hammering so hard her jaw hurt. Her breath smoked in the tunnel. Frost had formed on the inside wall where the damp rock met the warmer air from her body. Lantern drift was better than open ground, but only barely. It was a stone throat cut into the mountain, and stone stole heat as efficiently as wind. If she stayed still, she would freeze. If she wandered too far, she would starve. If she lit a fire without thinking, she might fill the drift with smoke and kill herself faster than the cold ever could. So she made a system. From first light until what passed for dusk under cloud and timber, Mara worked. She foraged for deadfall close enough to drag, favoring dense pine limbs and any twisted aspen or oak scrub she could lever loose from the hillside. Without an axe, she learned to use the mountain against itself, wedging branches between rock teeth and heaving until fibers screamed and snapped. She carried wood back one armload at a time, then went for more. And more. And more. Within 2 days she stopped thinking of it as gathering fuel and started thinking of it as building a wall. The mouth of Lantern Drift opened toward the northwest, directly into the worst winter wind. Mara stacked the first courses of timber across the entrance shoulder high, crisscrossing the pieces like cabin corners and packing gaps with brush, moss, shale chips, and snow. She left only a low crawl slit at one side, just wide enough to squeeze through. It turned the drift mouth into a choke point the weather could not rush. On the third day, she ringed a fire pit with flat stones from the back of the tunnel, then laid more stones nearby so the flame could heat them slowly all day. At night those rocks bled warmth back into the air by increments so small they felt like trickery. Yet without them she would have lost the argument before November ended. Food became her second profession. The rucksack ration was gone in 2 days. After that she lived by theft, patience, and whatever ignorance the forest was willing to forgive. She unwound copper wire from the framed seam of the pack and turned it into crude snares. She set them low in rabbit runs under willow clumps. She dug late rose hips from beneath fresh snow. She raided squirrel middens for cached pine nuts. She scraped cambium from beneath bark and chewed it until the bitterness went sweet enough to swallow. Each morning she steeped spruce tips and needles in a blackened pot she found rusting near the back wall of the tunnel, forcing down the sharp resin tea because she knew from old miners' wives that winter sickness often began where green food vanished. The labor was endless, and it changed her quickly. By the second week her skirts hung looser. Her knuckles cracked and bled. Her shoulders burned from dragging timber up the slope. Sleep came in short collapses between bursts of shivering and dreamless dark. Yet the barricade at the drift mouth thickened day by day, and with each additional rank of wood, Lantern Drift felt less like a grave awaiting use, and more like a brutal little machine she had built with her own body. She did not think often of Mercy Gap while she worked. Work was cleaner than memory. But Rowan never left her entirely. Sometimes she saw him in the angle of a boot print before snow filled it. Sometimes in the particular way her fire settled when pitch pockets caught. Once, while wrestling a dead pine trunk downhill, she heard her own breath hitch in the same rough rhythm he had after climbing hard, and the sound buckled her where she stood. She leaned against the log and let herself cry for perhaps 20 seconds. Then she pulled again. By mid-November, the first true blizzard hit. It came not as gentle snow, but as a wall. The air darkened in the middle of the afternoon. Gusts slammed the timber hard enough to crack branches overhead. Snow packed itself against the barricade in hissing sheets. Mara spent 8 straight hours feeding the fire, clearing the crawl slot, and checking the smoke seam above the mouth to be sure the draft still pulled. By nightfall the drift entrance was half buried, which should have terrified her. Instead, it saved her. Snow, once banked deep enough, insulated the wall from the wind so completely that the tunnel stopped breathing cold in great murderous gulps. The little chamber held heat better. Not warm, never warm, but survivable. When the storm broke 2 days later, the world outside looked erased. The timberline had vanished under white mounds. Familiar rocks were reduced to vague shapes. Mercy Gap might as well have been another country. That same afternoon, while digging a narrow sump pit near the back of the drift so wastewater would not slick the floor, Mara's knife struck metal. The sound was wrong, not stone, not root. Hollow. She dropped to her knees and clawed at the frozen earth with both hands until she uncovered the corner of a green steel survey box sealed in waxed canvas. The lid fought her. When it finally came free, the smell of oilcloth and machine grease hit the air. Inside lay things so valuable she simply stared for a moment before touching any of them. 3 packets of Strike Anywhere matches wrapped in paraffin paper. A shearling-lined coat, men's size, folded tight. A whetstone. 2 tins of rendered lard, a little stack of coffee bricks. And beneath them, protected in oilskin, Rowan's field book. Mara's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped it in the dirt. Rowan's handwriting filled the pages in compact engineer script. Survey notations, bearings, elevation marks. Notes on old claims abandoned before the First War. Figures that meant little until she found the clipped assay slips tucked into the back pocket. There the language sharpened into something even she could follow, ore content, density, purity. Repeated mention of scheelite, the tungsten mineral Rowan had once pointed out to her in creek gravel by lantern light, pale and hard and worth real money when found thick enough. Then she reached the final pages. The writing there lost some of Rowan's usual neatness. October 11th. East shoulder under Mercy Gap. Vein continues farther than First Corps suggested. Not stringers, real body. Thick. Clean. Rich enough to change every life on this ridge. October 12th. Showed samples to Vein after he cornered me outside the storehouse. Fool mistake. He hit it badly, but he knew what he was looking at. Asked how much. I said enough to free everybody here if handled fair. He smiled in a way I did not like. October 13th. Vane says the land title must stay quiet until winter. Claims he'll negotiate for the cooperative. I no longer believe him. He asked me to meet him at the old stamp mill after dusk to discuss the deed path. If I do not come back, Mara, it was not the mountain. Do not trust Elias Vane. Take the field book. Get clear of Mercy Gap. For a long time Mara could not hear anything except the fire. Not the wind beyond the barricade. Not the pop of sap in the wood. Not even her own breathing. Then the grief she had held in place with labor cracked open all at once. Rowan had not slipped. Rowan had not broken on bad timber. Rowan had found a fortune under the ridge, believed it might lift every starving family in Mercy Gap. And carried that hope straight to the one man rotten enough to murder him for it. Mara pressed the heel of her hand to her mouth until the first wave passed. When she finally looked up, the drift had changed. The barricade, stacked wood, the hot stones, the hidden cache, Rowan's coat, none of it felt accidental anymore. He had not simply shown her lantern drift on a summer whim. He had prepared a place beyond the reach of Elias Vane because, somewhere before he died, he had begun to understand the shape of the danger. Outside, the storm gathered itself again against the mountain. Inside, Mara rose, put on Rowan's coat, and fed another log into the fire. Elias Vane had sent Winter to bury her. He had made one mistake. Winter had reached her first. December arrived like a punishment without end. Storm after storm rolled over the San Juans until the world above Lantern Drift became pressure instead of landscape. Snow packed against the barricade, over the roofline of the tunnel mouth, and deep across the basin. Mara kept a narrow crawl shaft open with a length of sapling so smoke could vent and she could reach out for clean snow to melt, but otherwise she lived inside a pocket cut off from sky and distance. The cold settled into everything. It lived in the fabric of her blankets, in the handle of the knife, in the metal cup that stuck to her lip if she was careless. Some mornings, the lard tins were hard as chalk. Some nights, the fire burned low enough that she woke convinced her toes had frozen off. Hunger sharpened with the weather, her face hollowed, her wrists thinned. When she passed a shard of old mirror glass Rowan had left in the cache, the woman looking back seemed older by 10 years, and carved down to essentials. Still, she did not die. She ate snowshoe hare when the snares paid, field mice when they did not. Broth made from stripped bone and bark, coffee one pinch at a time on days when the dark pressed too close. She wrapped hot stones in torn cloth and slept with them tucked against her ribs. She mended boots with rabbit hide. She timed every trip outside against wind, daylight, and the fire's appetite. Little by little, Lantern Drift stopped feeling like a place she had hidden in and became a place she commanded. At night she read Rowan's field book by firelight until she knew whole sections by heart. He had been more thorough than she first realized. Between ore notes and survey figures, he had recorded names, dates, freight schedules, and quiet meetings he had watched from a distance. Elias Vane was not merely hoarding a mineral strike. He was building a land swindle in plain sight. The cooperative charter, all those speeches about sacrifice and mutual burden, had been used to consolidate control over every cabin, plot, and tool in Mercy Gap. The settlers thought they were building ownership through labor. In practice, Elias had arranged things so he remained gatekeeper of the deed chain. Then the buyers appeared in the notes. A man from Denver Steel, another from Pueblo, a banker in Montrose willing to advance on assay confidence alone. Elias had not meant to save Mercy Gap with the tungsten seam.
Sell the mountain, pocket the contracts, and leave everyone else holding prayer books and empty ration sacks. That knowledge changed Mara's revenge. At first, in the raw hours after reading Rowan's last entry, she had imagined only a rifle and Elias's chest. One shot, debt settled. But winter was long, and solitude made her honest. If she killed Elias in the timber, Mercy Gap might mourn him as a martyr, bury the truth with him, and let some other smooth-tongued thief inherit the same machine. If she wanted the mountain to spit out everything it had swallowed, she needed more than blood. She needed witnesses. By late January, the storms eased for a single blue day so cold the snow squeaked underfoot like dry sand. Mara used the brake to check a snare line higher along the basin wall, where willow brush cut across an old avalanche path. The sky was clear enough to sting. Sound traveled forever in that kind of air. That was how she heard the snowshoes. Not animal, not branch fall. Human rhythm. Heavy, deliberate. Mara dropped flat behind a drift and eased her head just high enough to see downslope. Two men moved through the timber below her, both carrying packs and rifles. The first she recognized immediately by the set of his shoulders and the way he leaned slightly left from an old mule kick. Silas Creel. The second was younger, thinner, bundled in a red wool scarf. Ezra Pike, Mercy Gap's assistant clerk. A boy more used to tally sheets than mountain travel. They stopped near a dead spruce. Trail comes into this basin and dies, Ezra said, trying to keep his teeth from chattering. Silas, we've been at this 4 days. She's gone. Or dead. Silas swept the slope with narrowed eyes. If she was dead, we'd have found bones. Vane says Quinn kept notes. Maybe samples. Maybe a deed sketch. If she reached whatever hole Rowan used, she may have all of it. And if she doesn't? Silas spit into the snow. Then we find the hole anyway. Mara felt the blood in her body turn deliberate. They were not out looking for a missing neighbor. Not even for her, really. They had come for Rowan's book. That meant Elias was frightened. It also meant the faint thread of smoke from lantern drift, if the wind shifted wrong, might point them straight to her. Silas and Ezra began climbing. Silas moved well for a big man, testing crust, scanning rock ledges and tree wells. Ezra stumbled often, breathing hard, his rifle swinging wild on its strap. They were angling toward the basin's shoulder, toward the hidden drift. Mara had no firearm, not yet. Only the knife at her belt and the terrain she had memorized through months of watching. Above her, on the lee side of a broken ridge, lay a loaded wind slab she had been avoiding since December. Weeks of storm had layered one hardness atop another there. Beneath the new crust, the old surface remained weak as sugar. Rowan had taught her enough mountain sense to respect that kind of slope. Step wrong, shout too close, or strike it with sudden weight, and the whole face might move. Mara looked from the slope to the men below. Then back. The plan formed complete. She crab-walked uphill through scrub fir, keeping low until she reached the shoulder above the slab. There she stood just long enough for her dark coat to cut against the snow. Ezra saw her first. There. Silas's rifle came up in one smooth motion. The shot punched limestone somewhere to Mara's right. She ran. Not blind. Not panicked. Exactly as she meant to. She crossed the upper edge of the loaded slope in a spray of loose snow, stamping a loud clear trail, then angled toward a notch where rock ribs jutted through the drift. At the notch she doubled back inside her own tracks, stepped onto exposed stone, and threw herself behind a cluster of Crumhole's pine plastered white with rime. Her chest hammered once. Twice. Then she forced it still. Below, Silas cursed and drove upward, Ezra following because fear hates being left alone. She can't be far. Silas shouted. They hit the slab at speed. For half a heartbeat nothing happened. Then the mountain gave a sound Mara would remember until her own death. Not loud at first, but deep. A cracking whomp under the snow, as if some buried giant had slapped the hillside from beneath. The entire face broke free. Snow dropped. Folded. Accelerated. Ezra screamed once before the moving white took him. Silas lunged back toward the ridge, but his second step vanished. The slab shattered around his legs and carried him downslope with timber, ice, and broken chunks of crust the size of tables. Mara stayed buried behind the pines until the last of it thundered into the ravine below. When silence returned, it felt obscene. She waited several minutes, then another 5, because mountains often killed the impatient after sparing them through the main event. Only when nothing else moved did she rise and work her way cautiously down the flank of the slide. The debris field was a churned wilderness of packed blocks, shattered brush, and powder plumes settling through the air. Ezra lay near a snapped spruce, half buried and folded wrong at the neck. Dead before he knew what had happened. Silas had survived. The slide had slammed him against a tangle of deadfall at the ravine edge and packed snow hard across his lower body. One arm was free, one shoulder clearly broken. Blood striped the corner of his mouth. His rifle lay 10 feet away, half sunk in debris. He saw Mara before she spoke, and the look on his face was not disbelief. It was recognition. He had sent a woman into Winter. Winter had sent one back. Mara, he rasped. For God's sake. She stepped close enough to hear the wet rattle in his breath. Up close he smelled of sweat, blood, and the fear men wear when force stops working. His free hand scrabbled toward her. Dig me out. She said nothing. Listen to me. Ezra's dead. You need help. I got rations. Rifle, axe. He swallowed and winced. Take all of it. Just get me loose. Mara looked down at the packed snow imprisoning him from the waist down. No quick rescue would free him. It would take leverage, time, and strength she could not spare, not in that cold, not with the light already slipping. More than that, she remembered the chain at the boundary, the missing coat, the cabin taken warm while he watched. The certainty in his voice, when he told her mountain law would settle the matter. You marched me out without a coat, she said at last, and her own voice startled her. It came rougher than she remembered, worn down by months of speaking only to fire. You told me not to come back. Silas tried to shake his head and failed. That was Elias. Orders. You seemed to enjoy them. His eyes flicked toward the valley, toward distance, toward any rescue not wearing Mara's face. Please. She retrieved the rifle first, a scope Springfield Sporter, clean, oiled, loaded. Then the pack, salt pork, hard candy, coffee, 2 boxes of cartridges. A small hatchet strapped to the side. More wealth than she had seen in months. She slung it all over her shoulders in pieces, feeling the center of the season shift. Silas started to cry before she turned away. Not from pain, from realization. Mara, he shouted after her, voice cracking wide in the frozen air. Don't leave me here. She stopped and looked back once. The snow around him was already tightening in shadow. Winter is honest, Silas, she said. It keeps what men give it. Then she climbed out of the ravine and left him to the cold he had assigned to her. By the time darkness fully fell, the last of his shouting had stopped. Everything after that moved faster. With the rifle, Mara no longer begged calories from snares alone. She brought down a mule deer in early March and smoked strips of the meat over a banked fire. She rendered fat into jars. She used the hatchet to cut timber that had once taken her whole weight and half a day to break. Strength came back to her in layers. First steadier hands, then color in her face. Then the return of something she had not allowed herself since Rowan died. Planning beyond tomorrow. Each night she laid Rowan's field book, the assay slips, and the hidden contract notes beside the fire, and arranged the facts until they formed a weapon sharper than the knife at her belt. Mercy Gap had been both guilty and deceived. Some had profited from her exile. Others had merely been too frightened, too obedient, or too hungry to resist Elias. That distinction mattered now. If she strode back and started shooting, fear would do Elias's work for him again. He would become chaos, and she would become the monster from the hills. No. She would give the settlement what Elias had denied it from the beginning. The truth in daylight. The thaw came slowly. By late March, meltwater began ticking from the eaves of the drift mouth at noon. Ruled the high shade, but south faces broke open into bands of black earth and old grass. The road down canyon would soon carry freight again. According to Rowan's last notes, Elias meant to meet his outside buyers as soon as the pass could take wagons without axle-deep mud. That gave Mara a narrow window. She spent it preparing. She cleaned the Springfield until the bolt ran silk smooth. She stitched oilcloth around Rowan's field book and assay slips. She practiced speaking aloud after months of mere silence, forcing full sentences from a voice that had turned to sandpaper. She packed only what mattered: ammunition, evidence, dried venison, coffee, hatchet, knife, one blanket, Rowan's coat. On the morning she left Lantern Drift for good, Mara banked the fire, touched 2 fingers to the blackened tunnel wall, and stood in the doorway of the life she had built out of theft from death itself. The drift had not healed her. It had not made her gentle. It had made her undeniable. 3 days later she crested the timber above Mercy Gap and looked down on the settlement that had buried her in its imagination months before. From a distance it seemed smaller than she remembered. The same cabins, the same storehouse, the same meeting hall with its pitched roof and brass ration bell hung on a timber post by the entry. Smoke rose from chimneys. Mud shone in the wagon ruts where thaw had eaten through the last hard crust. Men moved between buildings with the slow bent posture of a hungry spring. Women waited outside the store with ration books in gloved hands. Mercy Gap was alive, and Elias Vane still stood at the center of it. Mara watched from the trees long enough to see the pattern. Midday distribution at the meeting hall. All households called. Names checked. Flour, beans, lamp oil, seed promises for later. Elias speaking from the front as if scarcity itself had appointed him. Perfect. If she wanted witnesses, she would have them all at once. She descended the hill near noon, boots sucking in mud where winter had loosened its grip. The first child who saw her froze so completely his tin cup slipped from his hand. Then a woman turned. Then a man unloading kindling. Shock traveled faster than speech. By the time Mara reached the meeting hall steps, the murmurs had become a single, stunned silence. People backed away from her without thinking. She understood why. She was thinner than the woman they had exiled, harder in the face, darker under the eyes. Rowan's oversized shieling hung from her shoulders. A rifle rested easy in the crook of one arm. Wind and ash and months of mountain weather had carved away anything soft in her expression. She pushed the hall doors open with her boot. Inside, every bench was full. Elias Vane stood at the front beside the ration table, one hand on a ledger, the other lifted in mid-speech. He stopped as if a wire had yanked him still. Since Mara had known him, his composure broke before his voice did. "Mara," he said. No one moved. No one breathed. Elias recovered first, because men like him always tried to step back into command before fear finished arriving. "Friends," he said, smiling too quickly. "It seems the Lord has returned one of our own." "Not the Lord," Mara replied. Her voice cut clean across the room. "The winter." A couple of men near the door half rose from the bench. Mara thumbed the rifle bolt. That sound sat them right back down. Elias licked his lips. "You should have sent word." "We would have." "Buried me twice?" A tremor passed through the room. Nora Bell, near the middle pew, finally looked straight at Mara for the first time in months. Shame was written all over her face. Elias spread his hands. "This can be settled peacefully." "Good," Mara said, "because I came to settle it publicly." She stepped to the center aisle and pulled Rowan's field book from inside her coat. A few people recognized it immediately. Thomas Bell did. He had once helped Rowan shore an old claim shaft, and knew the little black leather notebook Rowan carried everywhere. "This belonged to my husband," Mara said. "The husband you were told died in an accident at the stamp mill." Elias's eyes changed then. Not much. Just enough. The room saw it. Mara held up the assay slips next. Rowan found a tungsten seam under the east shoulder of Mercy Gap. Not rumors. Not hopeful samples. A real body of ore, rich enough to make this entire settlement solvent if it had been handled honestly. Voices murmured. Confusion first, then hunger. Elias found his outrage. This is mountain delirium. The woman has been alone too long. Mara ignored him. Rowan wrote everything down. The vein line, the sample grades, the men Elias met from Denver and Pueblo, the contracts he was arranging while he told the rest of you to tighten belts and surrender more property to the charter. That landed, because everyone in Mercy Gap had surrendered something. A mule, a seed allotment, a strip of land, a tool chest, a winter coat, always temporary, Elias said, always for the survival of all. Thomas Bell stood before anyone asked him to. Thick-necked, sawdust still in the seams of his hands, Thomas had spent the winter repairing cabin beams in exchange for ration credits Elias controlled, line by line. "Let me see it," he said. Elias snapped. "Sit down." Thomas did not. Mara walked forward and handed him the field book. The hall was so quiet the pages could be heard turning. Thomas read the assay slips first, then the last entries. His face moved through disbelief, concentration, and finally something far more dangerous to Elias Vane than anger. Understanding. "He's naming dates," Thomas said slowly. "Freight dates, buyer names, core depths." He looked up. "These aren't guesses. They're lies." Elias barked. Thomas kept reading. Elias's right hand drifted toward his coat. Mara saw it. Did Nora Bell, who gasped aloud. So did half the room. Elias moved faster than his age suggested, yanking a small pistol from inside the coat. Mara was faster. The shot exploded through the hall, women screamed, children ducked, splinters flew as the brass ration bell hanging from the front post shattered off its hook 2 inches from Elias's head and slammed into the floorboards with a metal shriek. The pistol dropped from his hand. Elias stumbled backward against the wall, white-faced, staring at the smoking hole where the bell had been. Mara worked the bolt without taking her eyes off him. "If I meant to kill you," she said, "we would not still be talking." No one doubted her after that. Elias slid down the wall, hands open, all sermon gone from his face. Mara pointed the rifle at his chest and spoke to the room. "Go under the floor of Elias Vane's storehouse, right side, beneath the coal bin." Rowan wrote where he buried the first core samples and the cash advance from the buyers. "Then go to the stamp mill and look for blood in the plank seams under the west platform where Rowan met him. He didn't fall, he was beaten, then thrown." The room broke. Not into panic. Into motion. Thomas Bell handed the book to Nora, who read Rowan's last entry aloud because her voice was steadier than his. When she reached the line, "If I do not come back," it was not the mountain, something in Mercy Gap changed shape all at once. The settlers had been lied to, used, milked dry, and made complicit in one widow's exile to cover the theft. A miner named Caleb Rourke grabbed Elias first. Then another man, then another. Elias shrieked scripture, then law, then forgiveness, choosing whichever language might still buy him time. No one listened. They dragged him outside through the mud while he twisted and kicked, then locked him in the ore shed with his own wrists bound by freight rope. Mara followed the crowd only as far as the porch. There she stopped and looked out over Mercy Gap. The same people who had watched her eviction in silence now tore up the storehouse floor with pry bars and splitting mauls. Within minutes someone shouted that they had found a lockbox, then came the ore cores, wrapped in sacking. Then a packet of letters tied in blue cord. Then cash. Proof rose from beneath Elias's own building like something rotten forced to the surface by thaw. The state deputy from Silverton arrived 2 days later with 3 men and a warrant request already half written by Thomas Bell and signed by nearly every household in the settlement. They searched Elias's quarters, recovered the buyer correspondence, matched the handwriting, found the hidden contract drafts, and took statements until lantern light failed. When the deputy read Rowan's final entry, even he went quiet for a while. A search party found Ezra Pike's body in the avalanche run. Silas Creel was uncovered farther downslope,
frozen where the snow had locked around him.
Deputy called it what the mountain records always called such things: exposure, misadventure, no criminal act provable. Mara did not correct him. The law had enough to do with the living. Elias Vane was charged with murder, fraud, and unlawful transfer of cooperative property. The charter he had wrapped around Mercy Gap like a noose was torn apart in court before summer. Rowan's claim interest, and Mara's cabin rights, were restored on paper at last, though paper felt flimsy after a winter like that. In the end, Mara took what was hers, but not in the way Elias would have. She sold the validated tungsten share through a legitimate broker in Durango. Enough money to live without hunger. Enough to choose her next roof instead of begging for one. She signed Cabin 11 over to Nora Bell and Thomas for use as a schoolroom and infirmary, on one condition: no charter clause, no preacher, no council would ever again be allowed to throw a widow into winter and call it policy. By July she was gone from Mercy Gap. People in the valley said she left before sunrise with 2 trunks, Rowan's field book, and the Springfield across her lap. Some swore she went west. Others said she bought a boarding house in town. A few preferred to believe she stayed somewhere high in the San Juans, where no one could order her off land again. What everyone agreed on was this: Mercy Gap had sent Mara Quinn into the snow as a burden. Spring brought her back as evidence. And long after Elias Vane's name turned to courthouse dust, the mountain kept the better memory. A widow in a shearling coat. A hidden drift full of wood and fire. A bell exploding beside a liar's head. And the cold, at last, choosing the right side.